The sun beat down on the dusty square, a merciless eye in a hard, blue sky, and Ilara's world had shrunk to the rough timber of the post against her cheek, the bite of ropes at her wrists, the stench of stale sweat and fear. Her own. Each breath was a ragged tear in the fabric of the unnatural silence that had fallen, a silence that amplified the thud of Magistrate Blackwood's fist on his ledger. Ilara Vance, his voice boomed, a gravelly pronouncement of doom, for the willful defiance of a righteous proposal, for the sin of disobedience against community and order, you stand condemned. Jedediah Thorne smirked from the edge of the assembled townsfolk, his eyes gleaming with a possessive, triumphant malice. He was a man of substance, the magistrate had declared, a man who deserved respect, not the rejection of a penniless woman with nothing but pride to her name. Ilara's refusal had been quiet but absolute. She would not be his. The price for that refusal was this, the lash, public humiliation, a breaking. The first blow landed like a tongue of fire, searing across her back, ripping a choked gasp from her throat. Her vision whitened, then swam back in waves of nauseating pain. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the faces of the crowd were seared there, the avid, the cruel, the pitying, the deliberately averted. Another lash, and another. Her worn cotton shift, already thin, shredded under the whistling leather, exposing skin that blistered and wept. She bit her lip until blood filled her mouth, a coppery tang against the dust. Her gaze, when she could focus it, fixed on a tiny, stubborn weed pushing its way through a crack in the sun-baked earth at the foot of the post. Defiant. Alive. A spark of something that wasn't pain, something cold and hard, ignited in her chest. Let them see her bleed, let them hear her silence. It was all she had left. Each impact drove the air from her lungs, a brutal punctuation to Blackwood's ongoing sermon of her sins. Thorne's satisfaction was a palpable presence, more vile than the physical agony. She could feel his gaze on her, hot and proprietary, as if each stripe laid upon her flesh was a mark of his ownership. The world began to tilt, the faces blurring into a single, monstrous entity. Darkness lapped at the edges of her sight, promising oblivion, a welcome escape. But the stubborn weed remained, a pinprick of green in a world of brown dust and red pain. If it could cling to life here, so could she. The air cracked again with the whistle of the whip, but the expected agony was deferred, replaced by a sharp, indrawn breath from the crowd. A new voice, low and steady as a river stone, cut through the magistrate's righteous cadence. Enough heads turned. Ilara, her own head lolling, forced her eyes open, a blurry figure materializing through the haze of pain. A man, tall and lean, stood silhouetted against the brutal sun. He was an outsider, his clothes worn but clean, his face weathered by wind and solitude, not the soft living of the town. Magistrate Blackwood sputtered, his jowls quivering with indignation. Who dares interfere with lawful punishment? The stranger moved forward, his steps unhurried, yet purposeful. He stopped a few feet from the post, his gaze not on Blackwood, but on Ilara, a look she couldn't decipher, unreadable as the distant mesas. She will be my wife, he stated, the words devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undeniable weight. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Thorne lunged forward, his face contorted with rage. She's mine. This is an outrage. Blackwood, momentarily stunned, found his voice. On what grounds, stranger? This woman has refused a lawful offer, shamed a respected citizen. The stranger's eyes, the color of slate under a stormy sky, finally shifted to Blackwood. He reached into a worn leather pouch at his belt and drew out a few coins, their dull gleam muted in the harsh light. He tossed them onto the magistrate's ledger. The fine, then. For her, the coins clinked with a finality that brooked no argument. Silas, for that was the name whispered later in hushed tones, turned back to Ilara. He didn't speak, but his movements were gentle as he began to untie the ropes from her raw wrists. The moment the last bond fell away, her legs buckled. Before she could hit the unforgiving earth, strong arms were around her, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Her cheek pressed against a rough-spun shirt that smelled of dust, pine, and something uniquely his. The crowd parted silently as he carried her away from the square, away from Thorn's impotent fury and Blackwood's sputtering indignation, leaving behind only the echo of his claim and the scent of her blood on the town's cruel ground. Her last coherent thought before darkness took her was the astonishing, impossible fact that she was free of the post, cradled, moving. The journey was a blur of jolting movement and searing pain, punctuated by moments of hazy awareness. She felt the sun on her face, then the coolness of shade, the smell of horse and leather. When she could open her eyes, she saw the harsh, beautiful expanse of an unforgiving land stretching away on all sides, rocky outcrops, sparse, tenacious vegetation, a sky impossibly vast. Silas moved with the horse, a steady rhythm that was almost soothing, despite the agony that lanced through her with every step. He spoke only to the animal, low murmurs she couldn't quite catch. Some time later, the motion stopped. Through slitted, swollen eyelids, she perceived the stark outline of a cabin, small and built of rough-hewn logs, nestled against a low rise, looking as though it had grown from the earth itself. It was Spartan, almost grim, but it exuded a sense of solidity, of shelter. Inside, it was cool and dim. He laid her gently on a narrow cot covered with a thick, mended blanket. The sudden stillness was a relief, though her entire back throbbed with a fiery pulse. He left and returned with a basin of water and clean rags. His hands, surprisingly deft for their size and calloused roughness, began to clean her wounds. He worked with an impersonal efficiency, yet there was a carefulness to his touch that spoke of an unexpected tenderness. He applied a poultice of crushed leaves, cool and soothing, its scent faintly medicinal and earthy. She flinched when it touched the rawest parts, a small, involuntary sound escaping her, but he merely paused, then continued with the same steady care. He offered her water from a tin cup, holding it to her lips, and later, a thin, warm broth that she managed to swallow a few sips of. His silence was a vast, encompassing thing, not hostile, but watchful, allowing her space to simply be. He spoke only once, his voice as quiet as the rustle of wind in dry grass. "Rest," he said, his gaze meeting hers for a brief, unreadable moment before he turned and moved to the other side of the small cabin, leaving her to the pain, the confusion, and a fragile, unfamiliar sense of sanctuary. The word "a wife" echoed in her mind, a strange, unsettling brand, but here, in this quiet isolation, it felt less like a sentence and more like a shield, however temporary. Days bled into one another, measured by the shifting patterns of light and shadow that crept across the cabin floor. Elara drifted in a sea of pain and exhaustion, the world beyond the rough wooden walls a distant murmur. Silas was a constant, quiet presence. He tended her wounds twice a day, his touch consistently gentle, his movements economical and precise. The herbal poultices eased the burning, and slowly, agonizingly, her back began to mend. The open gashes scabbed over, then began to knit, leaving behind a network of raised, angry welts that she knew would become scars, a permanent map of her ordeal. He never spoke of what happened in the town square. He never asked questions. He simply provided fresh water in a pitcher by her cot, broth, then later, small portions of stew or roasted rabbit. He would leave the food on a small, unsteady table, then retreat to his own tasks, leaving her to eat in solitude. His respect for her privacy was a balm almost as potent as his salves. She watched him through half-closed eyes, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a hesitant curiosity. He moved with a quiet competence, whether mending a harness, sharpening an axe, or simply staring out at the vast, indifferent landscape. His ranch, she began to realize, was a marginal enterprise, wrested from the harsh land by sheer tenacity. A few lean cattle grazed in a roughly fenced pasture, a small patch of garden struggled against the arid soil. His life was one of constant labor, of making do. Yet, there was a dignity in his struggle, a resilience that mirrored the stubborn life of the wilderness around them. He was a part of this land, as weathered and enduring as the ancient junipers that dotted the hillsides. She began to make small movements, testing her strength. Sitting up was an ordeal, the pull on her healing back excruciating. But each day, she managed a little more. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking fence lines, she swung her legs over the side of the cot and stood, swaying, her muscles weak and trembling. The simple act felt like a monumental victory. She took a few hesitant steps, her reflection a gaunt stranger in the murky glass of the single window. The woman in the town square felt like a ghost, a creature of pain and shame. This woman, scarred and frail, was someone else, someone new, forged in silence and solitude. As her physical strength returned, a different kind of healing began. The terror that had been her constant companion started to loosen its grip, replaced by a fragile sense of safety. The silence of the cabin, once unnerving, became a comfort. It was a silence filled not with menace, but with the subtle sounds of the wilderness, the sigh of the wind, the distant call of a hawk, the chirping of crickets at dusk. And it was a silence that allowed her own thoughts to surface, no longer drowned out by fear. She began to venture outside, first just to the cabin stoop, then further, exploring the immediate vicinity of the small homestead. The land was stark but held a severe beauty that resonated with something deep inside her. She found herself noticing the small details, the intricate patterns of lichen on a rock, the surprising delicacy of a desert wildflower, the way the light transformed the landscape at dawn and dusk. Silas observed her tentative explorations without comment, but she sensed his awareness. He left tools where she might see them, a hoe by the struggling garden, a worn knife on the table. One morning, she found him watching her as she examined a particular plant, its leaves silvered and soft. "Yarrow," he said, his voice startling her. "Good for fevers." And to stop bleeding, he showed her how to identify it, how to crush the leaves to release their pungent aroma. It was the beginning of a new kind of communication between them, sparse and practical, rooted in the realities of their shared existence. He taught her other things, often without words, by demonstration. How to read the signs of weather in the clouds, how to track a rabbit by its almost invisible prints, how to mend a tear in canvas with neat, strong stitches. He gave her an old skinning knife, its blade worn but keen, showing her how to sharpen it on a whetstone. "For protection," he said simply, his gaze meeting hers, acknowledging a shared understanding of the world's dangers. It wasn't just for animals. The skills she learned were tools of survival, but they were also tools of self-reliance. Each new competency was a small act of reclaiming herself, of building a strength that was not just physical, but internal. She saw in Silas not a master, but a fellow survivor, his quiet resilience a mirror to the strength she was discovering within herself. His unspoken burden seemed to weigh on him, etched in the lines around his eyes, but he bore them with the same stoic grace he faced the harshness of the land. His version of wife was not about ownership, but about a shared watchfulness, a quiet alliance against a world that could be both beautiful and brutal. The fragile peace of their isolated existence was shattered one late afternoon by the distant sound of approaching horses. Ilara, who was tending the small vegetable patch, felt a cold dread clutch her heart. Silas, mending a bridle near the cabin, straightened slowly, his head tilted, listening. His eyes, usually calm, narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. She didn't question, scrambling into the cabin, her hand instinctively going to the knife tucked into her belt. Through a crack in the shuttered window, she saw them, Jedediah Thorne, his face still bearing a faint discoloration from a past brawl, flanked by two hard-faced men she didn't recognize, likely hired muscle. They rode with an arrogance that proclaimed their contempt for this place, for its inhabitants. Thorne reined in his horse a short distance from the cabin, his lips curled in a sneer. "Silas, you hermit! Come out and face your betters." Silas emerged from the cabin, moving with no outward sign of alarm, yet every line of his body was taut with readiness. He stood on the porch, his hands loose at his sides. "State your business," Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "My business? I've come for what's mine." "That woman you stole," he gestured contemptuously towards the cabin. "This is no life for her, scratching a living out of dirt with a man like you. She belongs in a proper home, with a proper husband." Ilara's blood ran cold, then hot with a surge of fury that surprised her. Before Silas could speak, she unlatched the cabin door and stepped out to stand beside him, not behind him. The sun caught the silvered scars on her arms where the shift had been torn, marks Thorne himself was responsible for. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried in the still air, clear and steady. "I am not your property, Jedediah. I never was. Thorn's eyes widened slightly at her defiance, then narrowed with renewed malice. Still got spirit, have you? We'll see how long that lasts when you're back where you belong. He looked at Silas. Step aside, dirt farmer. This doesn't concern you anymore. The unspoken threat hung heavy, promising violence. Thorn spat on the ground. Get her, boys. The two hired men dismounted, spreading out, their intentions clear. Silas didn't wait. He moved with a speed that was startling, a blur of controlled motion. One moment he was standing on the porch, the next he was among them, a force of nature. He didn't use a gun, though Elara knew he owned one. His hands, his feet, his entire body became a weapon. A sharp crack, and the first man went down, clutching a broken wrist, his face a mask of shocked pain. The second lunged with a knife, but Silas sidestepped the clumsy attack, deflecting the blade and using the man's own momentum to send him sprawling into the dust. It was brutal, efficient, and devoid of wasted movement. He wasn't fighting with rage, but with a focused, deadly precision. Thorn, seeing his hired help so easily dispatched, let out a roar of fury and lunged directly for Elara, his eyes wild. You stubborn witch, he bellowed, his hands outstretched like claws. Instinct, honed by Silas's quiet lessons and her own desperate will to survive, took over. She didn't scream, didn't flinch. As Thorn reached for her, she sidestepped, drawing the knife Silas had given her. It felt like an extension of her own hand. He grabbed for her arm, and she brought the blade up in a short, sharp arc, slicing across his forearm. It wasn't a deep wound, but it was painful, shocking. Thorn howled, stumbling back, clutching his bleeding arm, his eyes wide with disbelief and a new, unfamiliar fear. He had expected a cowering victim, not this fierce, scarred woman who met his violence with her own. Silas had subdued the second man and now stood watching Thorn, his expression unreadable but utterly implacable. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. Thorn, cradling his bleeding arm, looked from Silas's stony face to Elara's resolute stance, the dripping knife in her hand a clear statement. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a venomous glare. This isn't over, he snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. He gestured to his groaning men. Get up, you useless curs. Scrambling, they mounted their horses, Thorn last, his face pale beneath the anger. They rode away, not with the swagger of their arrival, but with the haste of defeat, leaving behind only the settling dust and the echo of their empty threats. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by their ragged breaths. Silas turned to Elara, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for injury. His eyes, those stormy grey depths, rested on hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something akin to approval, perhaps even pride. You are strong, Elara, he said, the words simple, yet they resonated deep within her. It was more than he'd spoken to her in weeks, a profound acknowledgement. In that moment, the meaning of his claim in the town square crystallized. Wife had not been an act of possession, but a shield, a declaration of protection offered in the only language men like Blackwood and Thorn understood. It had been a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Now, standing beside him, having faced down her tormentor, she felt a fundamental shift within herself. The shame that had clung to her like a shroud had burned away in the crucible of that confrontation, leaving behind a tempered strength. She was no longer Elara Vance, the publicly shamed woman, nor simply Silas's wife by decree. She was Elara, a survivor, a woman who had found her footing on the edge of the wilderness, her spirit scarred but unbroken. She looked at the knife in her hand, a faint smear of Thorn's blood on its keen edge. It wasn't a weapon of malice, but a tool of defense, of self-preservation. She wiped it clean on the rough grass and sheathed it. Later that evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold across the horizon, Silas silently handed her a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was worn smooth with age, clearly something he had treasured. He placed it in her palm without a word, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. It was an offering, a symbol of what? Freedom? Resilience? A shared journey? She didn't need to ask. She understood. This remote ranch, once a mere refuge, now felt like something more. It was a place where she was not owned, but respected, not defined by her past, but by her present strength. Here, she could forge her own identity, piece by piece, under the vast, silent sky. Years flowed by like the seasonal creek that sometimes ran near the ranch, etching their passage onto the land and its inhabitants. The story of Jedediah Thorne's humiliation at the hands of the quiet rancher and the scarred woman he called his wife slowly filtered through the sparse settlements and isolated homesteads. It became a whisper, then a tale, then a quiet legend. Some spoke of Silas with fear, a man who could disable two armed men without uttering a sound. Others spoke of Ilara with a kind of awed respect, the woman who had faced public disgrace and an attacker's rage and emerged not broken, but tempered like steel. They were left largely to themselves, a solitude that suited them both. The ranch, through their shared, unceasing labor, began to yield a modest prosperity. The garden expanded, its bounty carefully preserved. The small herd of cattle grew, their hides sleek, their calves strong. The cabin, once dark, gained a sense of lived-in comfort, with shelves Silas built holding dried herbs Ilara gathered, and woven mats she crafted softening the rough floor. Ilara's scars, once angry red welts, faded to silver lines against her sun-darkened skin, a permanent testament to her journey. She no longer flinched from their memory, nor did she try to hide them. They were part of her, symbols not of shame, but of survival and an unyielding spirit. She moved with a quiet confidence, her knowledge of the land and its ways as deep as Silas's. They worked side by side, a partnership forged in shared hardship and unspoken understanding. Sometimes, a lost traveler or a weary circuit rider would stumble upon the ranch. They would be offered water, food, and a night's shelter, given with quiet dignity. These visitors would leave with stories of the silent man and the resilient woman, adding another layer to their growing legend. They spoke of the peace that seemed to settle over the small homestead, a stark contrast to the harshness of the surrounding wilderness, a peace born not of ease, but of hard-won strength and mutual respect. Ilara became a symbol, though she never sought it, a beacon of resilience for those who heard the whispers, a quiet testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to heal and to overcome. The sun dipped below the jagged western peaks, painting the vast sky in hues of violet, rose, and fading gold. Ilara sat on the weathered porch of the cabin, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Silas sat beside her in his customary silence, his presence a solid, comforting weight. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, the evening song of crickets a gentle symphony. Decades had passed since the day he had claimed her in the town square, since she had stood against Thorne, knife in hand. Their hair was now threaded with silver, their faces etched with the lines of time and toil, maps of a life lived fully and fiercely. Their marriage had never been spoken of in conventional terms, never formalized by church or law beyond that initial, desperate claim. It had never needed to be. Theirs was a bond forged in fire and silence, a partnership of survival that had deepened into a profound, unspoken communion. It was a vow renewed each day in shared labor, in quiet companionship, in the mutual respect that was the bedrock of their existence. The scars on Ilara's back, long faded to pale traceries, were now just a part of her story, reminders of a past she had not just survived, but transcended. She was no longer defined by that trauma, nor by any name or role imposed upon her. She was Ilara, whole and self-possessed, her identity forged in the crucible of her own resilience and the quiet sanctuary of this wild land. The ranch was their legacy, a testament to their enduring strength, a small, tenacious pocket of life carved out of the wilderness. The wooden bird Silas had given her so long ago sat on the mantelpiece inside, its wings forever poised for flight, a symbol of the freedom she had claimed. Their story, whispered around lonely campfires and in hushed tones in distant towns, had become a quiet legend, the tale of the whipped woman who refused to break, and the silent rancher who offered not ownership, but a space to heal and grow strong. As the last sliver of sun vanished, leaving the land in the soft embrace of twilight, Ilara felt a deep, abiding peace. It was the peace of a battle hard won, of a life reclaimed. She had been the victim, the survivor, and now, she was simply herself, a quiet legend in her own right, her spirit as vast and untamed as the land she called home. The hope she had found was not in a dramatic rescue, but in the slow, steady burn of her own inner strength, fanned into flame by the unexpected grace of a silent guardian.